Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Okay, so sometime soon in Kansas City, anyone is going to be able to ride the bus without having to swipe a card or put money into a fare box. At the end of 2019, it became the first major American city, to shift toward running a fully fare-free public transit system, when the city council voted unanimously to do away with rider fares. And for the past year, Kansas City has been working to secure the funding that will allow it to move forward with this plan. So fare-free public transit seems like a radical idea at first, but if you look closely, it actually makes a lot of sense. For generations, public transportation systems have disproportionately disadvantaged low-income people, people of color, and people living with disabilities. Many of these people are largely reliant on public transit systems to get around, and rider fares tend to hit them way harder than they hit everybody else. When cities redouble efforts to shore up revenue from missing rider fares by cracking down on fare evaders, making arrests, using their carceral system to try to get revenue, they're the ones who bear the heaviest burdens from that. And when cities cut services in an effort to save money, these are the people who are going to suffer the most. So it's not just that fare-based revenue models are in some ways a regressive tax on the city's neediest residents. They're also not financially that sustainable in the first place. So in Kansas City, for example, rider fares amounted to about $9 million in 2019. That was less than 10% of the total operating budget that those fares were designed to support. So by divorcing revenue from fares and letting everyone ride for free, Kansas City took a big stride toward economic and racial justice. And experts believe that if other cities follow suit, it could encourage more residents to ditch their vehicles for public transportation, which would, of course, have large-scale benefits for public health and the environment and just the navigability of our cities. After all, we drive more and we own more cars than other industrialized nations, and that trend takes a huge health toll in the form of automobile-related pollution, traffic accidents, and trickle-down effects on the health of our kids. So many cities are beginning to take notice of these benefits. Nearly 100 cities around the world have abandoned public transit fares. US cities like Los Angeles and Boston are in the process of exploring similar moves that would allow them to follow in Kansas City's footsteps. But the big question you're probably asking is, how are cities going to pay for all of this if they're no longer bringing in money from riders? So the simple answer, which we're going to talk about here today, they're going to need support from the federal government, which has historically neglected funding for public transit. President Joe Biden's latest pandemic relief plan would direct $20 billion toward public transit agencies. That is significantly more than the amount contained within a previous congressional proposal, and a lot more than the, let me count them, zero total dollars that Republicans had initially proposed last year, but it's still far short of what the American Public Transportation Association says is necessary to ensure that public transit agencies can survive the pandemic's economic downturn. Complicated topic, very exciting, far-reaching consequences. I know at public transit, you didn't think this was going to be a really exciting episode, and now you're sweating and you're like sitting on the edge of your seat. But here with me today to talk about where these fare-free public transit efforts stand and where they could be going are Kansas City Mayor Quinton and Boston City Council member and mayoral candidate Michelle Wu. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
Good to be with you.
So Mayor Lucas, I'm going to start by putting you in the hot seat. As I mentioned at the top, Kansas City is now more than a year into this effort to make public transit fare-free for all. Can you give us an update on where things stand with that?
So we have already started our zero fare transit. It is one of the most exciting things that we have done in Kansas City. We passed it in last year's budget. And despite the COVID pandemic, we were actually in connection with it, we were able to roll it out even faster. Part of the reason being ridership was down. We could afford some of the changes. We did have federal relief funds to help us get through the time. And so if you were in Kansas City today, you can catch a bus for free, ride the entirety of the system. It's something of which we're quite proud. And now we really are looking at what are those long-term revenue sources to make sure that post-pandemic, we still have the support for it at a time where sales taxes that typically support our bus system aren't quite where they typically are.
So when was the last rider fee actually paid?
It would have been paid back in March. So it has been a shockingly long amount of time where we have not had this issue. And it's something that I think is exciting for everyone we talk about.
I'm wondering, what are you thinking of in terms of future funding streams? Where are you thinking you might be able to, post-pandemic, get sustainable resources to keep this going?
So in terms of sustainable resources to keep things going with it, we recognized before that fares, and the question at the top was kind of, where does the money come from if you don't have fares? Well, fares actually aren't that much of the system. It turns out that lots of your revenue is actually coming from other sources. In our city, we have a public transportation sales tax. And so that has gone to lots of it. And other jurisdictions, right, there are other ways through the city's general fund that this can be paid for. But in something that I think is actually most interesting, I mean, just think about it. Every American city has millions, if not billions of dollars of public infrastructure projects, usually on roads that are going through their city. I know we'll talk to Michelle Wu in a second, who is in the city of the Big Dig. What I would like to see us change is Department of Transportation priorities entirely, away from giving me a $50 million road improvement project that maybe cuts a minute off of some trips. Instead, saying for a much lower value, we can get people on the bus. We can have them riding for free. We get the attendant environmental benefits, the socioeconomic benefits, and frankly, we really can increase ridership in our bus systems.
You read my mind. I was, in fact, going to talk with Michelle Wu next, and you called it the city of the Big Dig. And my goodness, it has been the city of the Big Dig for so long. The city of the Big Dig when I was a teenager. So, Councilwoman Wu, I know that. Hold on a second. I think we're having some mic issues here. I'm just going to try switching my mic. Let's see if that helps. Is that better? I'm not sure what the feedback issue is on my end. Councilwoman Wu, I know that fare-free transit has been a huge issue for you, both as a member of the Boston City Council and as a mayoral candidate. Can you start by taking a step back and laying out the contours of this issue in Boston specifically? And how does the system work in Boston, and how does it disproportionately disadvantage vulnerable communities?
Yeah, this is an issue that I have been so excited to see gaining traction and momentum, and Mayor Lucas's efforts of really putting this on the map nationally have just been such an inspiration to us here. We've been talking about the fact that public transportation is a public good for a very long time here in Boston, right? We are home to, even way before the Big Dig, we did the first digging to build the country's first ever subway tunnel. And this runs from right near the Boston Common, from our Park Street to Boylston Street station stops. It was a huge innovation at that time, centuries ago, with public health and getting the first engines to be steam engines, so it could be underground, and getting travelers out from the above ground traffic. All the same principles apply today, that we know the inequities across our city in so many ways are exacerbated by lack of transportation, lack of affordable ways to get around our city. And so if we are to recognize the right to mobility, right, the benefits to everyone from getting more people on it, not just the riders who are able to get to where they're going more affordably and reliably, but drivers who have no choice but to drive, now having fewer cars in the road in front of them, everyone breathing the air with less pollution from fewer cars on the road. And so to hit our goals, we need to boost ridership by whatever means possible, and what investments have tenfold returns when it comes to the overall and economic and equity impacts. And so actually, similar to what we just heard, we had a window of time where we were in fare-free transportation as well. Our system went fare-free earlier in the pandemic, as the agency recognized this was not just the safest way to carry passengers, not having everyone crowding and tap all on the surface, but able to space on our buses, run our line faster because people could get on board and not hold things up. And it was for drivers, and it made it across the board, especially for essential workers. and
I just want to jump in for a second here because Mayor Lucas mentioned something a minute ago that I really want to get your take on, and sort of weaving into that what you're talking about here in the development of the process in Boston. As we all know, Pete Buttigieg was just confirmed as Transportation Secretary, and in the discussion of funding and of sort of like whether we fund highways or whether we fund, systemic transformations that could really change the way people access services in a major city. I'm wondering if you, Councilmember Wu, and then you, Mayor Lucas, could weigh in on what Pete Buttigieg can do tomorrow to benefit these plans and to give people access.
There is so much leadership that we need from the federal level to support efforts from the ground up. I am extremely proud that our Congresswoman from Boston, Ayanna Pressley, partnered with Senator Markey of Massachusetts to propose the Freedom to Move Act. And Congresswoman Pressley has also launched the Future of Transportation Caucus. So these efforts on the legislative side must be backed with a focus to fund, to prioritize equitable transportation, multimodal transportation, not just the highway infrastructure that would often bypass communities of color, immigrant, and class communities, but also contribute to the.
Councilmember Wu, I'm gonna stop you right there. We're having some audio issues getting your audio stream to flow. So Mayor Lucas, I'd love for you to hop the line here and talk for a second about what you want to ask Pete Buttigieg for. I bet you would ask for some of the same things as Councilmember Wu.
Well, yeah, actually, Councilmember Wu is saying everything that I could possibly think of in connection with making sure we're looking at equity in our public transportation projects, making sure that we're looking at multimodal forms, and not just kind of saying we're supporting studies, but really helping fund systems that connect either, right? Public transportation, bus systems, et cetera, bike, walk, all those types of issues where it hasn't typically been your FTA or your Department of Transportation issue or focus, but recognizing that how we move individuals in cities large and small, importantly, are actually going to be a big part of, I think, transportation in the decade ahead. So that's just one of the questions. The other one that I would ask for is this: let's reorient fundamentally how the federal government, how the Department of Transportation is interacting with local governments. Right now, it continues to be, in some ways, necessarily something where they talk about, well, we have several $billion and we want to spend this much money on a giant project in Kansas City. So what does that get us to do? It gets us to say that our shovel-ready project is a bunch of bridges or overpasses in an interstate, instead of actually being a bit more reasonable and saying, we don't need more lane miles. My metro area has more lane miles per capita, I believe, than almost anywhere else in the country. I see that as not a point of pride, but a point of real concern. And so what we need to say is, well, perhaps we don't actually, and this is hard for us in government to say, we don't want all of the same amount of money. We want it targeted. We want it on targeted projects, like those that are extending fixed rail transit within cities, like those things that are connecting cities. And that's going to be important as we talk about things ranging from fixed rail transit from city to city, bus transportation, so many others. And then importantly, how do we actually look to support and stimulate innovative systems? Zero fare transit in Kansas City is just one. Micro transit projects are something we see in cities around America. Those are the sorts of changes I think Secretary Buttigieg will be very interested in talking to mayors about.
The city council in Kansas City passed this bill unanimously, but I've noticed some pushback from free market think tanks, other fiscal conservatives. How did those sorts of arguments that cities, arguments from people outside these cities saying that these cities cannot afford long-term to eliminate transit fees, how do you think those arguments factor into the debate in Kansas City? And do you think they're having an influence nationally?
Well, I think they are morally and economically bankrupt. I'll go with the morals debates, and then I'll go with the economic issues. On the moral side, and I hear it all the time, there was the argument, and sometimes from seemingly credible sources, that said, oh my gosh, you're going to cause to increase crime because having unhoused patrons in the bus system will lead to ridership concerns. That is something that we haven't seen. Several months of experience on, we've seen there's been no increase in criminal incidents, police calls, all of that. In terms of the economic theory, I think it's already paying in some ways for itself. We're seeing that, first of all, we have an increase in ridership. It's allowing us to enhance consideration of more routes. It's allowing us to actually make sure that folks understand the system better. I mean, there are so many attendant benefits with what we're getting from zero fare. The only challenge that we've really had is the fact that our suburban communities have not joined into the system yet. And so therefore, yeah, there are going to be some inconsistencies. People have jobs in other jurisdictions. That's something we've been trying to fix. But on the long-term cost metric, it really is this. You're saving money from fare collection, you're saving money from idling, you're having a more positive environmental impact, and I think you're doing something that is just outstanding for society. So we are armed with both social, economic, all those sorts of answers. And to the extent that people have picked fights, it's been classic culture war tropes, which I don't think go particularly far when we're looking at new ways to try to get people to job access, opportunities, to healthcare, so many other items that are vital, and really, right, become so much more important during the COVID-19 crisis. Our mass vaccination sites, our on public transportation routes, or so as planned. Those are the sorts of things that we're trying to make sure we take care of.
So glad you brought up the pandemic, because you've made tremendous progress on this issue in a year of sort of unprecedented crisis, when many public transit systems are suffering from the fact that people don't want to be, in the case of New York City, like in a subway tube with other people breathing. So Councilmember Wu, I'd like to come back to you for a second, because you wrote this article for The Appeal about free public transit, where you outlined how the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored and in many ways exacerbated the transit crisis in this country. Can you follow up how public transit systems have been impacted over the last year?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so sorry. I think my sound is still not quite there. And so I don't know how much is coming up. But what I'll say briefly is that this is a moment to rebuild how things work, but transform the system. And that includes transportation as the foundation for everything else.
Councilmember Wu, thank you for that. I'm sorry, we're all having such sound problems. I can only assume that it's the nefarious people who are trying to work against free public transit in America who are interfering with our stream. They've clearly hacked us. There's some kind of grand conspiracy. So I'd like to turn for a second to some of the racial justice implications and ripples here. First, can both of you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. I was a public defender for the better part of 10 years, and I must have represented hundreds of people on what we used to call fare hop cases, which is when somebody's on the bus or the train without having paid the fare, and because they often were trying to get to school or work or the grocery store and didn't have the money, they were subject to arrest and jailing and had to be arraigned by someone like me. So what I see when I think about that is I see the cost of the police, I see the cost of jails, I see the cost of a person missing work and possibly losing their job over that arrest, missing school. I see the cost of economic mobility for entire communities. And I'm wondering, if you could talk, we'll start with you, Mayor, about other benefits your city may see in terms of the cost of jails and policing being lessened, and also just the racial justice implications of not continually subjecting primarily Black and brown people to the fallout of fare problems.
So absolutely. One of the early charges that particularly young people in Kansas City may get is the trespassing, which is the charge that we usually have for somebody who's on a bus and hasn't paid for the system. And we had a real equity issue because in Kansas City, we created a streetcar line, short line, it's expanding now, that was free. The reason it was free, well, it was in a different neighborhood of the city, but the thought was more people will ride, more people will feel comfortable if we do that. But we have this really bizarre world where the more heavily minority-ridden bus system, Black and brown folks were being charged, were running into more troubles, had a steadier police influence on board. And so we thought, well, gosh, we have to correct that. And so that is just one core and I think key equity issue. But there's also this. Right. Fundamentally in America, we have been giving an advantage to private vehicle or personal vehicle ownership. Despite incredible inefficiencies, we're subsidizing parking spaces on streets, subsidizing lane miles, and saying, oh, what else that you are in some way better, right? That was the goal for how you get around. What we're removing right now is that stigma of public transportation. We're removing that stigma of saying, yeah, well, this is something where, no, you don't have to wait in a long line. You don't have a broken fare box that's holding you up. You don't have a lot of folks that are waiting because someone doesn't actually have a card, or in the olden days, for many of us, didn't have the change, right? Those are the sorts of things that actually, I think, help make a difference for people. And I have loved, this is anecdotal, but I've loved hearing from people that are saying, thank you. I've got $2,000 back in my pockets. I've got this ability to get on quickly. I've got the ability to get lost, right? And still be on the system and not worry about cost and how long you're on and transfers. And those are the sorts of things that I think are a number of the other positives that we have with zero fare transit.
I hadn't thought about the ability to get lost. There's something so incredibly beautiful about making getting lost free.
Right.
Thank you for raising that as well. Councilmember Wu, I want to give you a chance to weigh in, assuming, let's check your sound stream again, but I'd love to hear you talk, especially in a city that's fighting fights over the construction of new jails and other sort of criminal justice related fights, for you to talk about the other impact of what free public transit could do in your community.
Absolutely. I think it's exactly as the mayor said, we are criminalizing poverty right now, and mental illness and substance use. And what we need to do is ensure that we are opening up opportunity for everyone, investing in community stability, housing justice, and transportation.
Thank you for that, Councilmember. I want to hear so much more from you, and I'm so sorry that we have a bad sound stream with you right now. But I did want to thank both of you so much for joining us. I hope this is the first of many conversations that we can have on this incredibly vital topic. Mayor, Councilmember, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So, as we continue to battle the worst pandemic in a century in hopes of eventually, quote unquote, returning to normal, we have to be willing to take a good hard look at the aspects of our society that maybe weren't working in normal times, and which the pandemic threw into stark relief. We have to resolve to do more than just go back to a problematic normal. We've got to get rid of the problematic normal. This is a chance to clean up. Public transit is one of those areas where normal clearly just wasn't good enough. We've heard from leaders who are trying to build something better, but for too long, governments have neglected those transit systems and let them proceed in a way that compounded and multiplied the inequality already existing in our society, with people who are marginalized and vulnerable bearing the brunt of the dysfunctionality of our public transit system. This has, of course, only gotten worse during the pandemic, and without bold action, it may well continue in that direction. So the good news is that we do have a prime opportunity here. You've heard from these leaders talking about the ways they can reimagine public transit and make it free for all in their cities. That shift would not only address persistent racial and economic injustice that still plagues many cities, but it would also push us toward a cleaner, safer, and more efficient future in which babies aren't breathing as many car exhaust fumes, in which people are using clean forms of transit more often, and in which everybody can afford to get to work, get to school, or even afford to get lost. You can continue following the latest news here on The Appeal Live by following The Appeal on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza, and I'll see you soon.